Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have another incredible episode for you guys, so hopefully you enjoy it. And today we're going to have a bit of an optimistic topic. We're going to be talking about the retreat of DEI. Yes, it is actually in retreat. Are there examples of this very nefarious practice being taken back a little bit in recent years and especially in recent weeks? In just over a week, University of Florida announced that they were firing all their DEI officers and DEI officials, and they're letting them go, which is a big deal. University of Florida is one of the, big universities in America. It's the flagship state school for one of the most populous states in the union, and it is saying we're not going to have DEI anymore. And this is not just simply the New College of Florida or Hillsdale or something of this sort, one of these conservative schools. This is a major university. This is a university that attracts kids from all over the country and especially all over Florida. And it's saying that they're now not going to have DEI administrators. That's a big deal. And at the same time, this is probably arguably even a bigger deal, is that in federal court, the federal government has a minority business development agency. And as the name implies, the whole point of the agency is to hand out loans and help minority-owned businesses. It was actually established by Richard Nixon, who everyone wants to assume is the most base president in the 20th century, but in fact, he really did expand the civil rights regime and many other things, but that topic is going to be reserved for an IQ supplement. But we'll just talk about the Minority Business Development Agency and what happened to it last week. Last week, a federal court ordered that it could no longer just help out minority businesses. It now needs to help out white business owners as well. Totally defeating the purpose of the agency. Is that why have a minority business development agency if it's now just a straight business development agency? They can no longer discriminate against whites who apply for loans and for help and from assistance from the agency. So it's now effectively just a normal business development agency. And that's a little bit something different than DEI. I mean, that is more on the affirmative action regime, but it's all part of the same picture. And that's been taken away. And this judge in the case specifically cited the Supreme Court case on an affirmative action where they knocked down affirmative action in higher education and being used in college applications, and said that this ruling now sets a precedent that this is against the law, that this is against the Constitution, and we're no longer allowing it. And even the federal government, in their defense, they were saying like, oh, we need this to rectify past discriminations. And the judge is like, well, there's been past discriminations, but the government hasn't been really responsible for that. And he cited that, the government has been in the business of rectifying past discriminations for, well over 50 years. So, this argument no longer holds water. And along with these developments, many of these businesses and companies that have been developing policies to hire more minorities and to celebrate their diversity and really imposing DEI policies have been backing away from these diversity metrics. A lot of news articles have been coming out saying this, like Axios had an article in January saying that companies were stepping back. If you even type in DEI businesses, retreat or something, you will see several news articles about this. I mean, one of the more recent is that Bloomberg was reporting that many banks and financial firms are backing away from the diversity metrics that they first announced after George Floyd's death, and they're no longer going to be insisting on this. And a lot of this is due to lawsuits that have been filed against them because they've had a lot of internship programs or associate programs which are restrict white males from applying for it. It's saying that only diverse people can apply for it. And obviously that's a violation of anti-discrimination law. And with the Supreme Court's affirmative action ruling, putting it on even shakier ground, they've decided to move away from a lot of these policies. And so they're backing away. Now, a lot of them still have the DEI training that's going on. And there's still some things that are, not going in the correct direction for some of them. The Stop Woke Act in Florida, which wanted to prevent more, rather than the hiring process, is more about the training that they're doing in businesses and schools, has still been halted by federal courts. So that's not really going through. There's been some other elements in the legal situation that have been not advancing as much as quickly, but you're seeing actual real progress. But when it comes to the trainings and stuff, most companies are still forcing, a lot of companies are still forcing their employees to undergo, this diversity training and learning about white privilege and other things, which they haven't quite found it as a violation of the law. I'm sure there'll be some cases to rule on this matter, but the training is still there. And even in a lot of schools, you're still seeing a lot of examples of kids being taught about white privilege and other noxious concepts. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but you are seeing actual results against DEI in America. So this is a positive thing, and what to make of it from going forward and what's really causing this. I think the real cause, some of it has been maybe the activism that you would have said of saying the people who have been going out and warning about DEI and critical race theory. Everyone called it critical race theory in 2021. Now they call it DEI, which DEI is more accurate, is what they are actually calling it. They've been calling it for years as DEI. Critical race theory was more the idea that they latched onto in 2021, which then a lot of companies and schools were saying, oh, we don't teach CRT. We only teach DEI. But now they're going specifically after DEI, which is a very good thing. And the person who gets the most attention for that is Chris Rufo, who has done a lot to expose this stuff in schools and in businesses. And he's probably been at the forefront, but there's been many other people who have been warning about this. I mean, Tucker Carlson was on air warning about this stuff before Rufo came along, and it is more of a joint effort on conservative media to raise awareness of this. And this did get a lot of lawmakers to start taking it seriously. But a lot of this stuff that was being passed in 2021, while in the right direction, it didn't have as much teeth as the stuff does now. Because what states, in a lot of states, Oklahoma is another example of a state, and there's a few other red states that have been really trying to get their universities to fire or make significant cuts to their DEI departments, is that they're now actually doing that at the university level. When there was CRT, a lot of these schools, they would have these rules that are like, you can't have anything hateful or derogatory. And then schools would just find a way around it. But now when it's specifically outlining DEI, and most of the legislation is going towards that, there's actual results of saying that they cannot teach these policies any longer or abide by these hiring practices any longer. So that's an important part. But the real probably giving it a lot of bite is that Supreme Court ruling last year, which curbed affirmative action and emissions policies. Now, when that ruling came out, I was a little bit skeptical because I was worried that a lot of these schools were going to find ways around it. And a lot of schools were announcing that they're going to find ways around it too. But they've been pretty strong on, following up with lawsuits saying, oh, they're violating the code of this ruling. Oh, they can't do this. And a lot of universities are giving up hope about trying to maneuver around it. And a lot of elite universities are bringing back standardized testing and applications and caring about that, realizing that before they're bringing in a lot of morons, and the only way that they can really understand whether they're bringing in the best and brightest is with standardized testing with SAT. A few schools might have the ACT, but SAT is usually preferred at the elite schools. They're still bringing that back. And that's another sign of, the universities are wavering in their commitment towards DEI. But so there's been to go back to the larger point, there's been a lot of follow-up on that to clarify what the ruling meant. And I had some skepticism that in some of the clarifications that they may, undermine that ruling or neuter it a little bit, but they've actually been making it more expansive and apply to greater situations, as seen by the Small Minority Business Development Agency, which that could come to the price of saying that affirmative action in hiring is just completely illegal. You cannot do that at all, and that you can't account for an applicant's race when you're in the hiring process. And now a lot of companies are moving away, are saying that they're moving away from DEI practices. From an anecdotal perspective and from young people who are applying into the job force, I do hear a lot more about how it's much harder to get hired as a white male at a lot of these top corporations now than before. And there is that statistic from, I was reported, I think by Bloomberg or Forbes or one of those magazines last year, where 94% of new jobs created went to non-whites. Now, the one thing to keep in mind about this is that this is new jobs created, not jobs in general. So if a job was there before, the title like assistant, I don't know, accounting manager or something, I don't think that might be a real job, but like, let's say accounting associate. And that job, that's a different data point that they would have. But if you created a new jobs that wasn't there but prior to George Floyd's death, 94% of those new jobs that were created, that were made out after, went to non-whites. So pre-existing jobs, it probably is different figure, but the jobs that they created and they replaced people, fired, or they left or whatever, that's not applying the whole 94% figure. But that's still something, that they created all these new jobs and they're done specifically for non-whites. And there's that data point, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence saying that a lot of these companies, even if they're not having formal diversity metrics, there are still informal demands to have a more diverse workforce and to favor non-white males when it comes to hiring. Now, if an applicant can prove that they've been discriminated against on this basis, thanks to the Supreme Court ruling last year, they now have a greater chance in court to make a lot of money and to punish the company for not hiring them. So that's a very good thing. So it's time to look at this in the broader picture of how positive this is, what this means for American society as a whole, what direction does it show America going in, etc., etc. So we'll go on a little bit about that. And so I think a larger, one thing that needs to be considered is that I did a podcast like 2 weeks ago, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago. I always get my time horizon messed up about when I talked about this stuff, but I recently did a podcast on whether they're putting the woke away, whether the regime is putting the woke away. And, this is a part of that, and that I think there is a lot of public outrage or public dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction is a better word than outrage, over how extreme wokeness and diversity and all this stuff is going. Now, America is far more diverse than ever before, and a lot of Americans do have more multiracial, multicultural friend groups than they would have 20 years ago, especially 40 years ago. And so people are experiencing diversity a lot more in their normal everyday lives than they would before. At the same time, people do get aggravated by these impositions on themselves, or the idea that they could be restricted from their dreams and ambitions just because of their race or gender. And now you're more likely to be excluded because you're a white male rather than being non-white male, which is, they always say, we got to rectify these past discriminations against all the non-white males, but now all the discrimination is against white males. And when you look at polling, most polls show that people don't like college admissions prioritizing the applicant's race. They would rather have that their merit and their skill and their intelligence is used to allow them into a university rather than their race. And so that's always been shown to be unpopular outside of blacks. Blacks are usually the ones who favor this. Every other group usually has majority in opposition. I think there have been a few polls that showing that even blacks don't particularly like this aspect, at least when they're polled. Politically, they're very much opposed to it because this is how they get into elite universities. So now this is responding to public opinion. And I don't think there's been, and I've never heard many employees and people at companies who have had to undergo DEI training and stuff who have been thrilled with it or have had a positive attitude towards it. And polling on critical race theory back in 2021 was very low. There was a lot of hostility towards it. Now, DEI is a little bit more complicated in how the polling is. Now, a majority of Americans say focusing on diversity, and I think they may just say diversity, equity, inclusion. And for a lot of people, with the exception of equity, which the right is doing a decent job on making equity sound like a scare word to Americans, but diversity and inclusion still among a lot of Americans, they think positive. Now, and this is a Pew Research. Pew Research is pretty much the gold standard for polling. It said, asking a question of whether focusing on DEI work is a good thing. 56% said a good thing. 28% said neither good nor bad. Only 16% said a bad thing. Now, when it came to the question of importance of DEI or focusing on our work at their own workplace, not many Americans were saying that it's very important for their workplace or that it should be focused on. Now, a different polling, I think, puts this a little bit more accurate because I think when they were said, if you had to explain this as like, do you believe that white privilege training at your workplace is important? I think a majority of people would have said no, would have said that that's not important. And that is a bad thing if they actually were taught about what is actually taught in these trainings. And they would have seen, there's studies showing that when these diversity trainings are done, that they actually don't increase workforce diversity or inclusion, that they actually make whites feel more bitter and resentful towards this, and that they are less likely to talk to minority coworkers because they're afraid of offending them and stuff. And it creates more tensions and hostilities within the workplace. Now, I think a more accurate poll is this from Marist that came out just a month ago. And this poll says that more than 80% of Americans think that diversity of race, ethnicity, and religion makes the country stronger. 42% said it makes the U.S. much stronger. 40% said it makes the country somewhat stronger. Now, what they think, now only 16% said it makes the U.S. weaker. Now, when it comes to the necessity of DEI training, only 28% strongly support mandatory DEI training in the workforce. So Americans in the abstract think diversity is a good thing, but they're not as thrilled with it to learn about it in the workforce. And I think if you actually asked and assessed people on what DEI training actually teaches, like white privilege and these how whiteness is evil and all these strange gender pronouns and all this stuff, most Americans would not agree with this. Polling still shows that a majority of Americans are not really comfortable with the gender neutral and all that stuff, pronouns and all that. They're not really happy with this stuff. So, and when you actually tell them, I think when they think, still in people's minds, even though I think conservatives are reversing this a little bit, DEI for a lot of Americans, if they just spelled out diversity, equity, inclusion, is like, oh, that sounds like a good thing. I'm for that. But if they were actually explained to them what it means, they're not for it. But a bigger problem is that Americans, by the polling, still view diversity as a good thing, as a positive virtue for society to strive for. Now, the practical policies around it, whether it's racial quotas in hiring or in education, they're not that thrilled with. But they do think that diversity is a strength, that it's a good thing, and that only a minority of Americans agree with our position when they're polled. Now, if you said when diversity means you're not getting a job or you're having to learn about how you're evil because of your skin color, polling would change. But the masses don't really share our negativity towards the words of diversity, equity, inclusion like we do, which conservatives have done. Conservative media has done a decent job at pushing this idea that diversity is not a strength of diversity. When you see that word, you're supposed to say, you're supposed to be like, that's a bad word. That's something that that's a code word for something evil. And I think conservatives have tried to convey that to their audience. But I tweeted this last week, but there is a disconnect between conservative media and their audience when it comes to these matters on race and diversity. Now, I don't want to say it's a total disconnect, but I think that the conservative commentators are more right wing than their audience at this moment. And this is something that's very different than what we would have seen when the alt-right was around and making these complaints about Conservative Inc. They were saying Conservative Inc. doesn't represent their constituents. They don't represent their audience. Their audience is more right-wing than their commentators. And if you went to the comment section of Daily Caller, Breitbart, you'd see some very base and red pill commentary. Now, those are the commenters. But I think for a lot of the audience, ordinary people tuning into Charlie Kirk or to conservative talk radio, they have different opinions about things. And when it comes to something like Martin Luther King, there is more criticism of Martin Luther King coming from prominent conservatives than at any point that I've been alive. You'd have to go back to the 1980s to find this many conservatives critical of Martin Luther King. And that's the early 80s, not the late 80s. But now you see a ton of conservative commentators criticizing him, and this is not quite the consensus yet, but it's a more tolerated opinion and it's a more mainstream opinion among conservatives. But among their audience still thinks Martin Luther King is awesome and would be supporting Trump. And whenever you see these AI created images of Trump with Martin Luther King, they go viral, and they're like, and they put Martin Luther King in a MAGA hat, and they're like, yes, this is totally true. And there's still that niece of his who goes out and is like, oh, Alveda King, I think is her name. I forget her name. She's not very important, but she goes out. I think Alveda King is another King relative. Anyway, they get the niece who's the one conservative King relative to go out, and she's like, my uncle would have totally supported Trump. And everyone loves that, and she gets invited on TV and talk radio. So there is still, the audience is still very pro Martin Luther King. And when it comes to diversity, I think the audience is conservative commentary has pushed them into a direction to thinking diversity. There's something wrong with it. There's something wrong with DEI. There's something wrong with ESG and a lot of these other terms that maybe the ordinary people aren't as familiar with. But now, thanks to conservative media, that they're more familiar with and they have a negative view on. But they still, if they're asked in these polls, do you think diversity is a strength? And they'll say, yeah, which we've still got a lot of work to do. Because in that Marist poll from last month, 69% of Republicans said diversity is a good thing, so it's a strength. And you're like, oh man, that's a lot. That's more than 2/3. So you've got a lot of work. We've got a lot of work to do to advance this. So the one thing you have to keep in mind is that we are curbing DEI again, almost against popular sentiment. Even though when it comes to elections, this issue is very good for us. Anti-CRT, which was the term used in 2021, if you had used DEI, I'm sure it would have the same results. Anti-CRT was a very big election winner for Republicans in 2021 when they ran heavily on it. And especially when it comes to elementary schools and middle schools, and you can see like all these parents go to these PTA meetings and these school board meetings and get really angry about the DEI that's being taught to their kids. So in effect, in practice, they still get riled up by this, but it's not as quite of a radical reaction towards these practices as I think a lot of the dissident right would think, as thinking that this is building, a white racial consciousness and that this is pushing America onto balkanized lines, that they're now seeing diversity as an evil, is that a lot of this is they may go to their school board meeting and get really pissed off about white privilege being taught to their kid. But then if they go up and they'll say, oh, I think diversity makes America stronger. This is the average American voter, okay? They have a lot of contradictory opinions that they hold. If you go up to the average American and you ask them for their opinions on stuff, it does not often fit into a nice ideological box. You'll meet Trump supporters who are pro-choice, or even Trump supporters who love immigration. You'll meet Democrats who have all these crazy ideas that they have that are not in line with the party dynamic and what the party is. I mean, a lot of Democrats, at least some of the more working class, or at least definitely the black Democrats, are not having a as positive opinion about immigration now, but their party line represents something different. So there's, the average person has all these views. And I think it's hard in our society where you're programmed from media and schools and just everything around in our society to think that diversity is awesome. And that what makes America great is that anyone can be an American, whether you're black, white, red, yellow, gay, straight, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, you can all be an American. And a lot of people get really thrilled by this idea. And I don't think a lot of the right is very thrilled by this idea, but we have a lot of work to do and to make our people better. So in a lot of the ways with the DEI stuff is that we have this very positive opinion. And this is more due to, I don't want to mean elite I'm going to use the word elite, but I don't mean elite like aristocrat or nobles or even truly what we may think even like business elites and stuff. I'm just saying it as elite level as this isn't quite the ordinary people. I wouldn't consider the conservative commentary elite or the conservative activist elite, but this is more on a top-down level of how we're getting DEI pushed, is that activists and conservative media have been really riled up the core base up in arms and on this issue, and they have forced Republican lawmakers to respond. Now, I think they're rewarded by voters. I think that this is a more popular issue than the polls show. I just think that you don't have the type of ideological development among the population that you would hope for by drawing attention to this issue. When we saw these issues first really popping up in 2020 and 2021, we were like, oh, this is really going to balkanize the country. This is really going to radicalize a lot of people. And I think it did among maybe conservative audiences. Well, the people that definitely radicalized were conservative commentators and the really hardcore conservative media aficionados, but it didn't really have the radicalizing effect on the American public that we thought it might have. And even you can have seen this stuff and there's always a disconnect between what conservatives are really caring about versus what the public cares about. And even what people who are likely our voters care about. One thing that you can definitely see is January 6th, where, if you go on Twitter, you're like, this is one of the top issues towards the American public. But in reality, for a lot of people still have a very negative view of January 6th and still think that the government is right to arrest a lot of these people. There was a story I just had popped into my mind from 2 years ago, or nearly 2 years ago, where some guy who was from rural Oklahoma, he had been in January 6th. I don't think he was involved in any of the violence or something, but he was just involved in it. And his whole community, which likely nearly all Trump supporters, ostracized him. And they were like, we can't believe what this guy did. And they're like, with the mentality that you see on right-wing Twitter, you would think that all these people would be seeing him as a champion or a martyr and would be going out and buying him a beer. Instead, they're like, not wanting to have any association with him. And this is a Trump-supporting area. And this is rural Oklahoma. And so if those people are not really taking a negative attitude towards this, just imagine how, blue-leaning suburbs and cities view these people. So you don't really have that you don't really have the political polarization that you see a lot on Twitter and social media go out into the public at large. I think that's something to be seen. Now, when it comes to DEI and that stuff, that doesn't really matter. And these people, they may tell pollsters one thing, but at election time at the ballot box, they generally favor the candidates who are wanting to get rid of DEI versus the ones who think DEI is extremely important. I think among Americans, they don't like the idea of diversity indoctrination imposed on them. They like diversity in the abstract, or just something that happens naturally, but they don't really want it to impact their business, how they're working, or whether they're getting into the university they want, or any of those type of interactions, and they don't really like, Americans really don't like censorship. So when it comes to that regards, they're also very hostile towards it. So that's just an ideological development we need to look at when we're discussing this issue. So 2 final thoughts on this before we get to this. I want to talk about what will be the results of this attack and this retreat of DEI on the public at large and in society, and how conservative media is developing and how these messages are getting across. I'll talk about the latter first. With this, I just need to clarify this. I've been alluding to this earlier, but I just want to clarify and solidify my position. Is that I see a lot of people who are always saying that you can see a real radicalizing effect on our people, and that they are getting tired of the regime, and that they're fed up with this stuff, and they're adopting new ideas. I think if you're on social media and if you're within your own bubble, you can definitely see that. And there are way more people into our ideas than ever before, even back in 2016 and 2017. There are way, way more people into this stuff now. Now, a couple things with that. These ideas that are identitarian in nature are not, I would say, the primary focus for a lot of people is that they stand alongside a lot of other issues, whether it's anti-GMO stuff, conspiracy theories, transgender stuff, or religious issues. And so there's a lot of other issues that everyone who gets into this stuff, they kind of adopt the whole buffet of options with the right. And I think in the past we were like, how about you just focus on the identitarian selection? Now they're just like, actually, I'm going to believe all this stuff. And so they'll have talking about the great replacement while also believing libtards are trying to implement eugenics policies on the American public, which I don't know how that works, but a lot of people, there's a great amount of people who are getting into that. But the one thing is that you shouldn't, when you look at polling and you interact with the American people, is that this point cannot be emphasized enough. They are not what they're like on Twitter. There's a very different attitudes and different reception towards these ideas and developments in American society compared to what we see on social media on a day-to-day basis. So conservative commentators may be very anti-Martin Luther King, but the average Republican still thinks that Martin Luther King was awesome and would be a Republican today. The majority of conservative commentators, this is even different than Martin Luther King. The majority of conservative commentators would say diversity is not our strength and would try to emphasize a negative attitude towards that concept. Meanwhile, the average Republican still thinks diversity is a positive because they live in modern American society. That's what they're taught to believe. And so there is a bit of a disconnect that's happening. And that's a large part because of just how American society is. As a lot of our base is doing relatively well economically. And economic prosperity, and if you get most of your hierarchy and needs met, you're not going to be that radical of a person. There's always this funny thing with the right is the right always wants to imagine that they are meeting their hierarchy of needs. Like, they are extremely wealthy. They've got a hot wife. They've got an awesome family. They've got everything going for them. And they've always been awesome too, that they were, the star football player in high school and stuff. And all these people imagine themselves being this. But at the same time, they have an insanely extremist views that a lot of society would deem as antisocial. Now, there are maybe a few people like this, but most people who have everything going for them do not adopt radical politics. And sometimes there's a problem with it because you get a lot of freaks and weirdos. But at the same time, you do need to understand that people need things going wrong in their lives, whether it's economically or socially or something, for them to actually adopt radical politics. And that's true for the majority of the population, is that when you have a relative degree of economic security and prosperity in society, it's not going to be a revolutionary society. If you go back in the past, whenever you see people adopting radical politics, it's usually a time of uncertainty and chaos and economic misery when they turn to these ideas. Now, that always happens. I mean, the 70s were a horrible decade for America. I would argue worse for America than today, in many respects. But you didn't see political radicalization happen, which That's worthy of an IQ supplement of why that had happened, but that's for another day. So that just has to be kept in mind, is that I think we conservative commentators and right-wing influencers are getting out a very strong message right now, and that strong message is impacting politics, but at the same time it's not having as much a receptive audience among Americans as we would think. But that can quickly change, and I think it is a positive in that we're advancing this message. I just think that there needs to be an awareness that it's not fully connecting as much as we'd hope. Now, when it comes to the social results of this war on DEI and affirmative action, I think this is where you could have potential for radicalization in our society. I think this is a 100% good thing, and I think it is going to advance in the direction we want. We thought that when this ruling happened, it's like, oh, they're going to find workarounds around the ruling, but now we're seeing that they're clarifying the ruling, and it's making it more of an attack on affirmative action in general. And you're going to see a ton of developments where more of these quotas are knocked down and deemed illegal. This is going to be very positive for American society in general. Now, there's going to be a couple of negative things that are going to happen for whites. When it comes to business practices, this will 100% benefit whites, because we are the people who are most negatively impacted by affirmative action when it comes to hiring practices. If those get eliminated, you're finally going to see white males won't have to worry about being discriminated against when they apply for jobs or when they're at jobs, and they're more likely to get fired than minorities when this comes into place. If more rulings come out in the courts pushing against this, that will be beneficial to whites. Now, when it comes to university admissions, at elite universities, I don't think it's going to have as much of a positive impact for whites. It's mainly going to positively impact Asians, which that creates an interest, I would say a concerning social dynamic where at all elite universities you could have 40% of the student population Asian, which is already happening in California, where they've eliminated that for many years. They weren't allowed to have affirmative action in university applications. And Asians have just dominated all the elite universities there. When you start to have 40% Asian, you're then building up an Asian elite class that is, and that has a lot of potential negative side effects for America. And I've talked about this at length. You don't really want an Asian ruling class, and I do worry that could happen with affirmative actions in place. And rather than benefiting whites, that it could just lead to complete Asian dominance of our elite universities. Now, you could just say East Asians, they've been getting into these schools, but they haven't been that influential over society. That's true, but this also applies to South Asians, and South Asians definitely get to dominant positions. If you look at all the CEOs of tech companies, they're South Asian. If you look at a lot of the political leaders in the rest of the Anglosphere, they're South Asians. I mean, England, Scotland, well, the UK in general, Scotland and Ireland, all led by men of Indian descent or South Asian descent. The Scottish Prime Minister is Pakistani. But so you could easily see that with that South Asians exploiting it, and I don't think I think most of our audience would be concerned by that. But this is a more positive development, is that I think when you are excluding a lot of these minority applicants who are the best that they have, they feel shafted by American society, and that they will adopt more radical politics in turn. Is that we have used affirmative action to really neutralize black radicalism for years. 60s and 70s, we had a major problem with black radicalism because their best and brightest were turning to the Black Panthers and other radical groups. And, this was a major problem for us. But one reason that affirmative action was advocated for is that we could turn these guys into just accepting the system. And largely they did. And we obviously still have black problems, but it's mostly, the crime level and stuff. It's not quite the level of the social unrest and social tensions and the political terrorism that you would have had in the 60s and 70s. But if more of these people are not getting into elite universities, that will push them into a more legitimately radical position where now they'll evince, radical politics. They'll talk about white supremacy and all this stuff, and they'll be repeating all these radical things. You see this all the time at universities. But then these guys go to work for a corporate law firm and stuff. So it's empty posturing. But now, if they're not getting into Harvard and stuff, then they may be more interested in actually implementing radical politics. And if you have a radical far left, that would have a radicalizing effect on the right, and that could create the circumstances where an American Chavism, which I've always referred to, and this is to Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and his political platform, and that brought to America, that's what I call American Chavism. Then you could see that type of political polarization and that type of radicalizing effect among normal Republicans that we've been expecting just through propaganda and the discourse. Then that would actually happen, because white America was very radicalized in response to Black Power movements, and it was neutralized. But if Black Power and Brown Power became more prevalent and more real, rather than just some college kid who's preparing to work at Goldman Sachs, saying this stuff and then him being bought out by the system, then that becomes an issue. So that's all things to consider on this topic. But now we're going to go on to our Cod of Elite questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Cod of Elite option at Highly Respected Substack. That's at highly-respected.com, and make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there. So we've got some new Cod of Elite members. This may set a record for the amount of questions we answer today. So I'm going to answer the new guys first. And the first question comes from Paul. Paul asks, he says, do you think that like in the last two elections in the swing states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, and maybe Nevada, that the margin of victory for whoever wins will be around 2%, 1%, or for most of them, as in the past, less than 1%? If that's the case, do you think that the Democrat early mail-in ballot harvesting operation in the big metro areas of those states and loose signature and identity verification measures by Dem election judges in those areas might be enough to give Biden victory? Also, I've heard of a recent New York Times poll, though, of only about 900 people, that about 97% of 2020 Trump voters will vote for him in 2024, and about 10% of 2020 Biden votes will vote for Trump in 2024. Do you think that seems right? And based on what you know, and what do you think is win each of these states, and by who do you think will win each of these states and by what margin? So it's way too early to tell which states will, specifically Trump wins by what margin. I think he is correct that it'll be no more than 2% in the states mentioned. It could, in a lot of cases, it'll probably be less than 1%, whoever wins them. I think Trump will win this election. It doesn't look like he's going to be indicted, and I've always said that if he doesn't get indicted, he has more than a 50% chance of winning. And every poll shows that, he's ahead by Biden. When a poll shows that Biden has like a 1-point lead, it's like a huge news event. But even, in 2020, Trump would have loved to have polls showing him just 1 point behind Biden. There were polls in the months leading up to the 2020 election that were showing Biden ahead by like 10 points. And I think the RCP average, like 2 months out, was like 8 points ahead. And that wasn't clearly the case on election day. And so if Trump goes in with a polling average of like +2 or +3, I think he's going to win. Now, which states he's going to win, it's a little tough. I think it's going to be tough for Pennsylvania because they have very terrible mail-in ballot rules there, and they're not going to change them beforehand. They've got a Democrat governor. I don't think they have a Republican supermajority. I think they have a split legislature. Michigan has a Democrat legislature and a Democrat governor, but Michigan may lose for Biden just of how upset these Muslim voters are about Biden, which is funny because Trump isn't really appealing to them much in any case, but he may still he may still win that state if all these Muslims just decide not to show up to vote, depending on what Biden may do. Now, if Biden gets a ceasefire in Israel or does some type of, I don't know, he looks like he's doing something against Israel, maybe these Muslims will vote for him. I don't know. The states I think he will win are Wisconsin. Wisconsin has a Republican supermajority state legislature. Republicans won it in 2022 when it came to the Senate race. And the guy who won it was one of the guys, Ron Johnson, who was leading Stop the Steal in the Senate chamber and was a right-wing guy. He still won that state. I think they'll win Arizona. I think Trump will win in Arizona. I think he'll win in Georgia. He may win in Nevada. And if he wins those 3 states and keeps all the states he won in, or 4 states rather, if he wins those 4 states and keeps all the states he won in 2020, he'll win. So Michigan and Pennsylvania are going to be a lot tougher. I don't think he's going to win any states outside of the battleground area. A lot of people are talking about Virginia. Virginia is a very different state from what it was when Republicans were really competing for it and was a battleground state. Yes, the Republicans won in 2021, but that was a bit of a very, very pro-Republican year. And there were a lot of animosity towards the COVID lockdowns, and Democrats just had a terrible message in 2021. And it's really tough to win Virginia when you have Northern Virginia suburbs that are just absolutely blue central. You know, Bush won Fairfax County in 2000. The idea of a Republican winning anywhere in Northern Virginia now is unthinkable. So it'll be very tough for any Republican to win. I think it'll be a very small election margin that he wins. Now, on the second question on the Times poll, that sounds, I don't know about the 10%, but the 97% sounds right. And all these polls are showing Trump ahead, and everyone wants to deny that the polls are valid. And we heard this from the DeSantis people. Every poll's fake, and then Iowa shows up, and the polls are 100% right. The only thing they got wrong was that DeSantis got a little bit higher of a margin than he was supposed to. And now Democrats are about to say that every poll's fake, which it can be off by like 2-3 points. It's not going to be off by like 10 points. And generally polls have shown that there's a high favoritism towards Democrats. You know, the polls are supposed to show Democrats with an advantage. Now in 2022, this turned out to not be the case because Democrats are winning college-educated whites at a higher rate, and those are the voters most likely to turn out and most likely to vote. And so there is a little bit of a disadvantage. But when it comes to Trump, Trump has a better ability to get out and turn out those non-college educated white voters than anyone else in the Republican Party. So, yeah, I think it'll still be a small margin. I think he'll win Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia for sure. I think those are still very red states. I think, and Arizona with the immigration problem, and now more illegal immigrants are coming through Arizona. I don't know how Trump would not win that state, especially when they're getting so negatively impacted by it. Pennsylvania and Michigan will be very tough. I would not count on it. Nevada, I think, is a more likely state he would win than Pennsylvania and Michigan. And it will be by small margins, but as long as you win, that's what's most important. So that'd be the answer to that question. Now we've got another new question, or several questions from user called Tux. And so his first question we got is, I agree 100% with your recommendation that young conservatives should embrace university education rather than pursue trades. Trades have their place in society, but without college, your avenues for career advancement are limited, and thus so are the chances to challenge prevailing orthodoxies in historiography, journalism, social science, and even the hard sciences, all of which influence government policy and what gets taught in schools and how mass media report current events. You just can't wrest control of our cultural institutions from the current elite without having gone through college. My questions: One, should young conservatives still consider big name private institutions like Harvard, Yale, Columbia, etc., even given how hostile these schools are toward anything beyond the left of center? Or are these schools a lost cause? What about schools with good academic reputations in major metropolitan areas with Democrat supermajorities like New York, Boston, Chicago, or Philadelphia? Two, should prospective students avoid federal student aid? Three, should people on our side pursue graduate degrees, masters, or PhDs? One, if you get into Harvard, Yale, or Columbia, you should go. That's my answer to that. I think but I think for a lot of better conservatives, due to the cost of college, I still think the best idea for a lot of kids is to go to your flagship state university on a scholarship and do really well there and possibly pursue a graduate degree. I'm still pro graduate degree. I don't think a master's is worth your while unless you're really interested in academia. Academia at this point, there could be reforms there where there's red states that are actively trying to hire conservative PhDs, which really should be pursued. And there is a bit of a potential going on in Florida right now where they are trying to find at least centrist PhD candidates. But academia is, extremely left-wing. There's not a lot of jobs available. And especially in one field like American history, it's all now black history. It's all just black history, and white males cannot get hired for these jobs. Even if you're a huge liberal, you can't get hired for this stuff. But before I fully answer that, on second, should prospective students avoid federal student aid? No, you should just be smart about it. You shouldn't get too much into debt, which is why I stress for a lot of kids, if it's going to cost you an arm and leg to go to one of these elite private institutions, they do try. And I would say a lot of the best universities do try to offset the burdens of federal student loan debt more than flagship state schools. And if you do get into one of the top tier schools like Harvard, Yale, Columbia, you should go. But if it's maybe like George Washington University or something like that, maybe the not so top tier, I would recommend going to a flagship state university and going on a scholarship there. New York, Boston, Chicago, or Philadelphia. Boston and Chicago have very safe parts. Chicago, the problem is the best school to go there. Chicago is not in the nicest area, and Philadelphia, it's the same. Penn is also is surrounded by not so nice areas. But that's a personal question. But you should, when it comes to federal student aid, you should just try to keep your debt at a minimum. And pursuing graduate degrees, law degree is still important. We still need lawyers. We still need people with graduate degrees. With PhD and going into academia, we do need to have a more concerted effort among conservatives to make their flagship state universities, make their public universities hire and favor conservatives when it comes to academic positions. And maybe we could have this. And once you have those opportunities where they're not trying to get flaming leftists for these ideas, this could offer opportunities for bright young conservatives to go into this. So, but I would probably not recommend going into taking an academic path. I do recommend graduate degrees. Medical school and law school and the stuff that are a little bit more about learning a trade, so to speak. But I think it's very difficult. And he talks about it. If any of your listeners are considering a career in performing arts, I'm going to recommend against the vice of most conservatives and say that they should take up that opportunity. I'm a classically trained musician, and although we associate high culture with the left, you'd be surprised by the number of people on our side who are in the domain of classical music. And he talks, when I went to conservatory, there were a surprising number of conservative students, even a left-leaning city. And if you have the requisite talent, which I didn't, you'll have opportunities to do well for yourself and help convince other people in high culture toward our side who are amenable to persuasion. I would say that would be a very good idea. So his second question is just asking, have you considered doing IQ supplements on individual Western artistic or literary accomplishments and their associated histories? These could cover anything from important basilica like St. Peter's, Wagner's Ring Cycle, Beethoven symphonies, art or literature, or of the Renaissance, or St. Augustine's City of God. A lot of this stuff I would like to do, but I'm not an expert on this stuff, and I feel out of my element when I'm talking about this. I am going to do a supplement on Wagner because I can just do his biography and not be fully focused on his music because I'm not trained in musical theory. So I could sound like a total idiot when I'm discussing this. But I can talk about their biography, their impact, their developments, and in a way that is open to entryists or open to the layman, and I'm a layman myself. So we could to discuss some of this stuff, some of the more important literature. But on my list of IQ supplements to do, there is one to do a Wagner IQ supplement because there's a good biography I want to read on him. So that will be out this year. And he then gives some classical composers to say Keed or cringe. Gustav Mahler, Arnold Schoenberg, Dmitri Shostakovich, Oliver Messiaen. Mahler, cringe. I hate Mahler. I'm not a fan of Mahler. I think the only thing I like from him is the Sixth Symphony. Everything else, but it's only tolerate the Sixth Symphony. Everything else is just horrible. I really don't like. Schoenberg is interesting. I would not say so. I would say cringe for Mahler. Schoenberg, interesting. I'm not as opposed to him. I like Alban Berg's opera Wozzeck, which is very similar, very influenced by Schoenberg. I'm not as into Schoenberg's works as much, but I do prefer him over Mahler. So I would put him in a neutral category. Shostakovich, some of his stuff is terrible. Some of his stuff is all right. He's very hit or miss. I would not say keyed. For Mission, which I mispronounced earlier. Once again, I am terrible with French pronunciation. With Mission, I really like his work. The Quartet for the End of Time. So I would say he's in the keyed category. These are very modernist composers. I don't know if people would really like Mission or Schoenberg. Hopefully they don't like Mahler. Most people could get into Shostakovich because there's a lot of influence that he's had on film scores, but a lot of it's very cheesy. So that would be my opinion on that. So those are some very great questions we've got from both of our new Cotton Elite members. And now we're going to go to some of our more mainstays. I know people have been wondering, it's like, where is the questions from K-Max? Where are the questions from New England Refugee and everyone else? So we'll go with K-Max first. And K-Max always has a lot of questions. And first question is, Scott, and adding to my woman question from last week, Katie Britt's State of the Union response to Biden's State of the Union. I feel it is exactly a pretty girl without much substance and almost a speech made for parody. Your view of Katie Britt and her response, was it more laughable than Biden's speech? Yes, it was a joke. But all these SOTU responses are bad. They're always bad. They always hurt the politicians who do this. That's why they generally don't pick somebody with presidential ambitions or aspirations, or maybe somebody that they're trying to introduce more to the public. But now she's just a punchline. And this has been the case. Back in the 2000s, it was more of we're highlighting our leaders. But ever since, I would say, Bobby Jindal's SOTU response to, I believe it was Obama. It had to be Obama. Why would Republicans do a response to Bush? To Obama, and Bobby Jindal was supposed to be the seen in this future party. He's like, oh, this is a minority candidate. He's from a southern state. Oh, this is going to be our Obama. And they kept building up as our Obama, as Republican Obama. And then he gave a SOTU, and it was so terrible that it really hurt his political career. Marco Rubio still had a lot of political, clout after his SOTU response, which, he famously picked up a water bottle during. But overall, besides the water bottle thing, it wasn't that bad. And compared to other SOTU's responses, it's probably been the Republicans' best, or anyone's best, in a long time, because it did not hurt his political career. It actually elevated it, and he was still a serious candidate in 2016. So that's probably the best one, and that was still not very good. Democrats have always been laughable. There was one time, I think this was 2017, they got an old white Democrat from Kentucky to go give his from a diner to show that they care about the forgotten Americans, and it was so hokey and cringe. Most of the time they don't have I think that might have been the last time there was a white male giving a SOTU response. But with Katie Britt, she's very young, she's attractive. There is talk about her being a possible vice presidential or running mate for Trump. I don't think that's the case. I think it is such a clownish thing, but it's a very hard type of speech to give because most politicians, they don't know. You're supposed to give like an informal, like, hey, we're having a conversation. It's like a fireside chat, like with Roosevelt. And instead, it's just this weird scripted event in a strange place, like in a kitchen. She should have just done this from a platform and been more authentic with it. But you don't have a real audience with you. So it's always hard about how you're supposed to talk to people. And most people can't have like this folksy conversation with the public, which is what it's always supposed to be. And they instead have Katie Britt with her like acting. It's like, this is outrageous. How can you do this? I am a mother. This is an attack on America. And just the acting. And I think it made it ripe for parody. And everyone thought it was not very good. You could have said it was but the Republicans did this too. They really have a problem with college educated women, and they felt that Britt could help with their problems among white women voters. Maybe it had some effect, and like she really leaned on being a woman in this, and she's an attractive woman, and so they have to push her as their person for it. But generally, all these are very bad. And it's especially the case with Katie Britt. But maybe it did okay among the targeted audience. So we are going to go through more of the questions. We'll finish up with K-Max. He's got one more question. Scott, the immigration for years, neocons and legacy media told us it was such a losing issue, restricting it in any way, shape, or form. Among Super Tuesday voters, even in Virginia and Iowa, it was the number one issue over the economy. What was the impetus to lowering it always? The donor class, the Gallup poll, I think we'll link here, shows for over 30 to 40 years, Americans wanted a decrease in immigration. The GOP ran away from the issue back in the 1990s when support for eliminating immigration was the highest. How did the elites of this country end up getting so far apart on the issue the masses oppose? Is there a bigger divide on any other issue between elite opinion and the majority of Americans? Yeah, I mean, well, it's now the number one issue among Republicans because, we're having over 200,000 immigrants or illegals cross the border every month. I mean, that's never happened before. And so it should be the number one issue among Republican voters. And it impacts all the country. And there's, I was seeing some viral posts on Twitter saying, they're like, oh, illegal immigration is my number one issue. And they're showing like some rural county in Pennsylvania. The thing is, that county may be getting a ton of illegal immigrants. Like all these counties, rural counties everywhere, and rural towns are receiving illegal immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees. No place is immune from this problem. And this is why it's becoming the number one issue, because they feel that this is radically transforming this country and it must be stopped. And so going back to an earlier point where the DEI stuff and, these ordinary Republicans are still not quite there on diversity, they're getting there on immigration. There is a high degree of support for immigration restriction among Republican voters, and and Republican politicians are responding to that. Now, on the divide question, yes, it was all donor support. It was that they believed that immigration was important to our economy and we needed more of it, so we couldn't restrict it. And their donors told them to curb these elements of that. And support for limiting immigration was the highest, and there was a massive support. The problem is in 1990, they passed a huge increase in immigration. The 1990 Immigration Act is arguably more responsible for the Great Replacement than 1965. 1965 did not dramatically increase in numbers. What it did is it was a symbolic message saying that America is no longer a race-based country, is that we're going to allow the whole world into our country. And what happened is that instead of a lot of Europeans coming to America, then a bunch of Asians started coming to this country. And that's where majority of Asian immigration has come from, was 65 Immigration Act. It did place limits on immigration from Latin America, which led to a lot of illegal immigration. And then the 1986 amnesty then legalized all these people, which massively increased Hispanic immigration. But 1990, they tripled the amount of people who could be allowed into this country. So every year. So that happened in the 1990s. But then by 1995, everyone was wanting to limit immigration, including Bill Clinton. But yes, donor and business interests helped to undermine this effort. And they did pass a mild immigration restriction that was mainly aimed at illegal immigration and immigration enforcement in, I think, 96 or 97. But that was not what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be basically a reversal of the 1990 Immigration Act, but they didn't get it accomplished. So yeah, no, that's been one of the major issues that have been masses opposes. But now a big difference with the 90s is that the overwhelming majority of Democrats now favor immigration, which if you went back to the 90s, it was not really a partisan issue. Is that you would see support for immigration restriction both among Democrats, Republicans, and independents. But now among Democrats, it's a point of principle to be in favor of open borders, while with Republicans, it's a point of principle to be wanting immigration restriction. So yeah, I would probably say yes. That's the biggest divide among all issues. That's the biggest divide between elite opinion and I don't know if a majority of Americans, but I would say among Republicans, that's the biggest difference between donor opinion and the majority of Republicans. Because among a lot of Democrats, they're now much more in favor of open borders than they would have been in the 90s and 2000s. So that is the answer to that question. And now we've got a question from, I don't know what people, you gotta name your pseudonym when you come and ask me questions. Well, we'll just call him Bill. I think that's fine. There's millions and millions of Bills and throughout America. I don't think we're going to be doxing him. He's got a good question, though. If we're going back to it, it's about the primary going on in Arizona. Scott, over the weekend, you re-X'd. We're using a thing. An old post from Abe Hamadeh in which he delivered a very cringe take. In the congressional primary, Mr. Hamadeh is competing in is particularly interesting as his main opponent is Blake Masters. Both candidates are ostensibly MAGA, but it seems as if Trump world is lining up behind Hamadeh. What is your assessment of the Hamadeh versus Masters primary, and what can you tell us about internal conflicts within MAGA and the future of the party? Hamadeh, yeah, the question is that his post, I think it was from 2012, where he hoped for an alien invasion to unite all the world, regardless of race, religion, and stuff. Hamadeh's an interesting guy. I think he was technically raised Muslim, but he claims to be Christian now. But Hamadeh does have a little bit more charisma than Masters, and he has a better ability to pitch himself to the ICP than to Masters. And to put this in more positive perspective, he has a better ability to pitch himself to a Trump audience. Like if he goes before a MAGA crowd, a Trump rally, he's definitely going to know how to reach them much better than Masters. Masters is more like a lot of the Anon sphere. He's a tech guy. He doesn't really quite interact with the public as well as some politicians. He's a little bit more into intellectual ideas, I think, than a lot of politicians. While Hamadeh is just like total, I would say ICP, insane clown party mindset, which is why, but he knows not to go too far to make himself, quite on the level of Boebert or some of these other candidates who are just too ridiculous to even win. But he is MAGA, and Trump world is lining up behind him because Kari Lake endorsed him and Donald Trump endorsed him as well. And I think Hamadeh probably will win, even though I've heard that Masters' fundraising is doing much better. It's too hard to say. This could be a different district. This district could maybe be not as excited for ICP as other districts would be, and maybe they will like Masters more than Hamadeh, but who knows? I would say from right now, I think if you have Kari Lake's and Trump's endorsement in an Arizona Republican primary, you're most likely going to win. I'm not saying he will definitely win, but from what I was told from people who had been involved in Masters' campaign, he was supposed to soon drop out, but maybe the polling isn't as bad and maybe his fundraising is a lot better than expected. So he's supposed to drop out after Trump endorsed Hamadeh, but that hasn't happened, so they're still facing off against each other. But it is an important battle because it represents something of Trumpism and what could be the future of Trumpism. I don't think Hamadeh would be that bad in Congress. He'd probably vote the way we want. He would not be as ridiculous as MTG and Boebert, so he would still be fine. And Masters, I know, has issues as well. But you would probably rather have a Masters rather than a Hamadeh. Hamadeh, really, I don't think he has strong beliefs. Based on that tweet he sent in 2012, I think he may have been in college. He's around my age. Both Hamadeh and Masters are near my age. It's both young guys, but that does indicate I don't think he has as strong of opinions, especially compared to Blake Masters' opinions he was making in college around that age. Masters was into some goofy libertarianism, but that was very much in close relation to the alt-right and NRX stuff at that time. So Hamadeh was into much more normie tier stuff. And it's a similar way to Carrie Lake. Carrie Lake just adopted a lot of her views in the last few years, or in 2020. And she had been a Democrat before and going to drag shows and stuff. But they're both, Carrie Lake has an incredible level of charisma and she knows how to connect with the MAGA audiences more than anyone else besides Trump. So that's a huge reason for star power. And what the real debate is between people. Blake Masters represents a type of J.D. Vance wing of we're going to make Trumpism more sober and respectable and maybe even a little bit more boring, but we're going to keep these policies and maybe advance them a little bit more in a direction than even Trump would do. So it's like Trumpism focused on the policies, but foregoing the style. Hamadeh represents Trumpism solely focused on the style. Now, it may still have the policies, but what matters most is the style over the substance of Trumpism. And you see that in a lot of candidates who are now trying to run to be Trump's heir and in the Trumpist sphere. And generally, the Trump wing favors the candidates who are in the Trumpist style over the substance of Trumpism. But sometimes that's for obvious reasons, is they want to get the most exciting candidate and the most fervent supporter of Trump in there, and generally the people who favor the Trumpist style will go to the mats for Trump. So there are reasons why they endorse him, but there are problems when it just becomes the clown show is the primary goal rather than making America great again. And Hamadeh would probably be an okay congressman, but I do think that there is an issue when you turn towards more of these candidates. And there is an issue that Hamadeh is, part of the multiracial working class, so to speak. When he's, of course, he's not a part of the working class. His family's pretty wealthy. His brother gave a massive donation to his campaign. But Hamadeh, it does represent how we're now just kind of a multiracial clown show, and that's really what we want to carry on this carnival-like aspect about Trumpism, but we're not actually accomplishing really what we set out to do, and we're further alienating college-educated whites. Blake Masters had his own problems with winning over college-educated whites, but I think candidates more along the lines of Masters can help us win a greater share of the white vote and actually accomplish the things we set out to achieve versus the more Hamadeh types. But, I'm not that opposed to him. And it's even the same with Carrie Lake. I was like, I want Carrie Lake to win in the Senate. There's a lot other worse candidates than Lake and Hamadeh, but there are issues with them where they just turn this into more of the carnival rather than a political movement. So we still have a lot more questions. So we'll go with Kingslander. He said, "Hi, Scott. Why did the Republicans have a tough time winning the Electoral College post H.W. Bush until Trump? Clinton and Obama won all their elections with 330 plus electoral votes, while W. Bush barely got more than 270 in both of his elections. Also, how much of a drag was Perot on the Republicans in the 90s? If he hadn't run, would they be more competitive, or did he draw votes from both Democrats and Republicans? A lot of this is obviously demographic change, and we're an extremely different country from 1988. H.W. Bush was supposed to lose that election. A lot of pollings leading up showed Dukakis kicking his ass. And then he kicked Dukakis' ass in November. And there was type of this middle white America that was independent. It could go both ways, whether Democrat or Republican. We weren't as politically polarized in the 80s. So if the economy was going bad under Democrats, they could just flip to the Republicans. If there was a feeling that this Democrat, as Dukakis was betrayed, would be soft on crime and wasn't fit to lead the country and fit to be commander in chief, because he had an infamous incident where he was on a tank and he looked like a goofball, which these type of incidents are made to be more important than they actually are, but they do highlight issues with that candidate. Dukakis was seen as, we were still in the Cold War at the time. The Soviet Union was still around, and they felt that he would not be a leader we could trust to, deal with the Soviet Union. Well, H.W. Bush was a CIA director and a vice president. He had the gravitas to deal with the Soviets. And the soft on crime issue really hurt Dukakis. So the public flip, in the polls, which is very unlikely to see that today. It's like you could see maybe the public flip 5 points or 10 points in favor of Biden's direction. But it was like a massive flip in that election, because the polling was horrible for H.W. Bush throughout much of 88, and then he won in a landslide. So very, very hard to see that happening. And so it's just like it's just these dramatic changes that have happened. It's like we're a far more diverse country. I talked about political polarization in it before, but people are much more set in their political preferences now than they would have been in the 80s and 90s. There's a lot of Americans who may have been, had social conservative views, but they would have voted Democrat. There have been a lot of people with social liberal views who would have voted Republican. Now those people are just vote Democrat and Republican, and you're competing over a much thinner slice of the electorate. It's why it's much harder for Republicans or Democrats to have a massive control of the House of Representatives and Congress in general. Like the effective supermajority Obama had when he came into office in 2008 is pretty much unthinkable now, just due to the demographics and how polarized people are, and people are really set in the political preferences. You're really competing over a tiny slice of the electorate now, while there's a much greater slice of the electorate that could go either way in the 80s or 90s, which allowed for H.W. Bush to win in a landslide in 88 and for Clinton to win in a landslide in 96. Perot definitely hurt Bush in 92. I would have to look at how much Perot votes took away versus who he's taking more from, whether it was Clinton or Bush. I mean, Bush, the economy was in a slump at that time. Generally, that's not a good sign for an incumbent president in re-election. He had a lot of charisma problems and connected with the public, while Clinton was an incredible politician and very charismatic. I think he did take more votes away from Republicans. My mom voted for Perot rather than H.W. Bush. So that does show that there are Republicans who would vote for who went over to Perot rather than Bush. So that was a huge harm to him. But it's also that Bill Clinton was very moderate. I mean, they did try to... Conservatives at that time, people always wonder, is like, conservatives are just milquetoast and wanting to get along with the other side at that time. No, Republicans really developed this own the libs as their foundational principle in the 90s, and they turned Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton into... Bill Clinton was the Antichrist towards them, and they were very hateful towards Bill Clinton. But for people outside of conservative media sphere, they were seeing him get tough on crime, pass welfare restrictions, leading America as the, ultimate superpower. and the economy began booming. So they voted for Clinton, and he didn't seem that radical, which compared to Democrats later on, he wasn't. And the economy and everything was going very well in 2000 when they picked Al Gore, who is a little bit more left wing than Bill Clinton, and are at least more committed to left wing policies and principles than Bill Clinton, than Bill, who doesn't really have much commitment to principles. And Al Gore obviously had a lot less charisma, and he still won the popular vote in 2000, but he lost in the Electoral College by a handful of votes in Florida. But to go back to the question, it's just a very different electorate now. It's very much more diverse. Obviously, Republicans aren't doing as well among whites as they should be, particularly among middle class whites, college educated whites. But even though our electorate is still over 70% white, when they were running in the 80s and 90s, it was even whiter, is well over 80% white. And there was more of this just middle American demographic that they could go either way. And so you could have a overwhelming electoral performance. Now every election is going to be done at the margins. It's going to have a narrow majority for either side. Republicans are going to have a hard time winning a popular vote, no matter who they put forward in presidential elections going forward, but that doesn't really matter. It's about winning Electoral College. And Republicans can still win over 300 plus votes in the Electoral College going forward. It just won't be, they just won't have these overwhelming majorities in the Senate and House of Representatives as they may have had in the 2000s, or they could, and they never got one in the 80s, but they did get these overall. They were getting strong majorities in the 2000s. And they did have a strong House majority in the 90s as well. On the Ross Perot question, without him in the race, it would have been more competitive. I think Clinton would have still won. A lot of his voters, he won 19%. A lot of the voters may have not voted at all if he won, and maybe he drew equally. But it would have been a very close election without Perot in there. Clinton probably still would have won, but it is what it is. So that's a little bit of political history and my thoughts on that and why Republicans are. It's worth returning to. I'll probably would be interesting to do an IQ supplement on George H.W. Bush, but that is something for in the future. Now we've got Dollar Bill. He's got 2 questions. We've still got a lot more questions, folks. He said, something boomers have become infamous for is haranguing retail workers with difficult and unreasonable demands. I saw one Facebook post where a boomer woman was upset about her encounter with a cashier. Why? Because she ringed up her purchases while sitting down. You mentioned that years ago you worked at a grocery store, and I'm sure that you have stories of older customers giving you grief over trivial reasons. Why do you think they act like this? I've heard 2 theories different about why they have this attitude. As you get older, your body accumulates more aches and pains, leading an individual to become more crabby and irritable. And in the 70s, Sears began using the phrase the customer is always right in their marketing, which the boomers took to an excessive degree. I would say that those 2 things are true. I mean, boomers, as you get older, you obviously get crabby and irritable. You're old, you're seeing young people being happy, you've got health problems, you've got all these experiences in life, you're not able to do what you want, and you really take it out on younger people as you get older. Most of my problems when I was worked in retail, both at a grocery store and at a Domino's, believe it or not, when I was in high school, did not come from old people. I don't remember old people really cussing me out. It was more middle-aged people, people in their, at that time, 30s and 40s. And 50s who would just have a meltdown. And usually maybe some guy had a bad day at work, or they're just an asshole in general who would just cuss you out. It wasn't so much the old people. The old people were just kind of difficult to understand because they had all these demands. There was a seniors day we would have at the grocery store, and they would just want the groceries bagged in a certain way, and they could barely move, so you had to take out the groceries for them. Which is whatever. That's what you're supposed to do. I think today it's a bigger problem because younger people are on TikTok more, and they're able to highlight these issues with boomers. And I think boomers who are now getting older are driven for more hatred for the youth by political news and their own news. I mean, there's always been this tension between old and young. But I think now, boomers really hate young people, And a lot of Republican politics is based on hatred for young people. I always say that national divorce is about Gen Xers and boomers wanting to get away from their own children. And I think that comes to play with interactions in retail situations. But there's also, it is worse customer service now than ever before. I remember growing up, you had to say please, thank you, like have a smile on your face and be a pleasant experience. Whenever I see like a cashier smile and like, hi, how are you doing? I'm like astounded. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. When I travel down south, I'll experience it. And every time I'm like, wow, I never see this. Usually it's like, what do you want? Frown the whole time, bye, and that's usually the experience. So I can understand why boomers get more upset. But I never do that because of my own experiences. So there's a couple of things. And yes, a lot of boomers, even my experience in retail, the customer's always right. They thought that meant that you're a slave for them and that they can order you around. There's also just people who like taking out, feeling a bit of power over people, and they see that with cashiers. And they'll definitely do this with young white kids. Young white males, they feel that they're more, because there's no social taboo around chewing out a white kid. But if they did that with black or Hispanic or another minority, or even a woman, people would shame them. But if you attack like some young white male, it's like, that kid's lazy, he needs that lesson, and like everyone's clapping for him. So if you're a young white male working in retail, you're going to get the most grief of anyone, because there's no social taboo through against cussing you out and giving you a lesson you deserve, or supposedly deserve. So that's his first question. Second question, when you're out in public, is it common to see people who are clearly too old to be in school walking around wearing backpacks? It is where I am, and I don't like it. I associate backpacks with school children, and to see people with gray hair wearing them reminds me of our society's Peter Pan phenomenon, where aging people refuse to grow up. So you have middle-aged men wearing t-shirts of Marvel superheroes and video game characters, where pre-boomer old men would wear suits, respectively doff their hats to women and refrain from cursing. I can only imagine what elderly millennials will look like in the retirement home with their faded tattoo ink Avengers t-shirts and swearing about the Honduran worker at the legal marijuana store who gave them bad customer service due to their lack of English. I'm going to be saying this. When I used to go to work, I had a backpack to carry my laptop around. I generally prefer it than the sling briefcase, which I always hated. I guess that's more adult, but I always hated it. The backpack was there. There's been times where I'm like out and I'm like, oh, people may think I'm one of the kids getting out of school, which I'm clearly not. So I'm not anti-backpack, but I'm very anti older adults wearing shirts made for kids, like of Marvel superheroes, or even band shirts. Band shirts, once you're over the age of like 22, you should not be wearing a band shirt. But it is delayed adolescence. I would not say backpack. Backpacks are just more convenient for walking around. You're walking faster. It gives you, much prefer it over a briefcase or anything. Your hands free, and it's more comfortable than that sling laptop case you have, where it's across, or the strap is across the shoulders. So I don't want to be too anti-backpack here, but yes, there is a delayed adolescence in a lot of how people act and behave and how they dress in public. But I don't want to attack backpacks, because I'm part of the backpack crew. But it is, it depends on how they're dressed. If they're dressed in like a button up and slacks, it's like, okay, fine. If you're, dressed in cargo shorts and a Iron Man t-shirt and wearing a backpack, then yes, you're looking like a middle schooler, and you shouldn't do that. So that is my answer to dollar bill. We've got even some more. So I hope you guys have taken a nice seat. We've still got 3 more questions from people. And this one's from Appalachian. He says, "Hi Scott, I've noticed that stores in my city have started to lock up shoes and electronics, and cognac is now consistently behind the counter at liquor stores. What is the solution to the law and order problem in the U.S.? I hesitate to support giving more powers to police. Do you think that the spike in immigration directly correlates with the spike in crime? Or is mass theft a forever staple of America's magical people after the 2020 riots?" It depends on where you live. You know, in New York, a lot of the looting is now being done by these new arrival migrants, but in other places it's generally magic. So it's the illegal immigrants, depending on which city you are probably contributing it to it, but for most places it is magic Americans who are doing it. The solution, it's really happening only in these major cities, and the major cities have a liberal population that does not want to come down hard on this because they've been trained to view blacks as persecuted victims, and looting and shoplifting are victimless crimes. And most of our crime problem is right now quality of life issues and shoplifting. So you're seeing more litter, and you're seeing more stuff locked behind the counter, and more people are getting away with these type of petty crimes. It's less crime to deal with violent crime and murder. Now, certain cities, there is a huge spike in murder, like DC. Major spike in violent crime. You know, there's like armed carjackings and other things. But in most cities, it's the main crime problem they have is affecting quality of life rather than physical safety. And it's a little bit harder to deal with that. Like, people are like, we need a Bukele. We are not going to have, first off, a president is not able to have a mass concentration camps for shoplifters. Second off, the people that are doing the shoplifting, if we saw them lined up like the people in Bukele's prisons, the American people would riot because they're all trained to view blacks in a positive light and to view this as racism. And like the whole world would condemn us for arresting all black people. So I don't think that is really going to be the case. And also, it's a local problem. So it's up to local people to view this as an issue. And it really just has to be that these liberals in these cities get tired of it and vote for district attorneys and mayors who will crack down on this, who will actually crack down on this and actually pass laws. Because, you know, the mayor in New York wants to claim he's getting tough on crime, but the district attorney is then letting him out. And they're not dealing with the cash bail reform that now lets all these criminals go. You really just have to punish these criminals. So you have to reform the laws that allow them to get away with shoplifting up to a certain amount. I think in California, up to $900 you can shoplift with it just being a civil violation or a very, very mild misdemeanor, which of course they don't even enforce. And you have to change that and start really throwing the book at shoplifters. You have to allow police to stop and frisk and get tough on criminals. And then you would not have, you know, everything locked behind the counter and locked when you go to the convenience store. And so that's really what has to happen. But it's a local affair now. It's primarily a local affair. Some of this stuff, the crime problem in the 80s and 90s, could be solved at a national level because a lot of it was centered around the crack epidemic and drug trade, and having mandatory minimums for people caught with crack cocaine helped reduce the crime problem, because a lot of the murders and robberies and stuff were dealing with the drug problem. But now it's we're not at a level culturally and socially where we can get people to be behind that stuff now. And really what they're doing, instead of, you know, shooting somebody to get $10 to buy more crack, they're instead just looting the store of, you know, electronics and stuff like that, and Sudafed. And that's what they're doing. I don't know if they're robbing, I don't know if urban areas are robbing Sudafed. Maybe they are. But they're taking that type of stuff away from the convenience stores, and candy and pretzels, I guess, whatever snacks they want. And it's a very different problem. And having a national like crime crackdown on shoplifters is obviously not going to go well with the public. And so the people who care most about crime are in the areas not experiencing the high crime rate that we see on TV. You know, it's like the suburbs and rural areas, which are not really experiencing much crime. While the people who are in the high crime areas don't want to embrace these measures that would actually solve the crime problem. So it's a little bit different, but crime is solved on the local level. Can be solved on the state level by eliminating the cash bail reforms and the sentencing guidelines for shoplifting and stuff. But outside of it, it takes local will. It takes your district attorney to throw the book at these people. It takes the mayor and political leaders to take the handcuffs off police and allow them to enforce the law. So that is his question. Now we'll bring up Mystery. Mystery's always got good questions. Hopefully he wasn't worried that I was going to forget about him, but we've got Mystery coming up, and he's got two different questions. Oh, actually, he asked a question about Blake Masters and Abe Hamadeh as well. So I already gave my thoughts on that. So I will just answer his one question. He said, "Hey Scott, do you have any thoughts on gay signaling affectations and mannerisms among upper middle class straight men? Gay voice, snooty cattiness, general effeminacy, etc. You think half or more of the dudes at my office were gay, but then they would show me pics of their kids. It reminds me of the dandy and powdered wig area, and I'm under the impression that Roman elites used androgyny to signal their elitism during the decadent phase, but I don't have a source for that. And any book recommendations you have about the decadent phases in culture and Roman culture in particular would be appreciated." I don't really have particular sources on that. I don't know about that's true with the Roman elites. A lot of Roman elites were having to deal with like the barbarians. There's a lot of more like landed elites that were having barbarians come in and trample their property and stuff, and they had to muster militia and others to counter this. You could have said that they maybe were a little bit too decadent. I think their decadence was more that they're just focused on hedonism rather than being dandies, so to speak. And even at the era where aristocrats were dressing in a flamboyant manner and having dandy aspirations, they were also all challenging each other to duels and to defend their honor. So there's a weird thing with that. The differences that we're seeing is it's like the Redditification of a lot of American men. And a lot of these guys will have a Reddit voice, Reddit hobbies, and Reddit very nerdy attitudes towards this stuff, and they won't be growing up, and they revel in these Reddit attitudes. And I think that's just a major cultural problem. I don't think it's so much among the elites, because it's as you're saying, you're seeing this at your office, and maybe your office is extremely elite, but I think it's just much more apparent among broad stratum of American society. And it's not even just limited to the middle class. You can the hick lib phenomenon. You can go out in rural areas and find guys that are just like soy jacking over their toys and stuff. So I think it's a broad cultural problem that's driven by Reddit. And, in some ways of the culture generation, I don't really have a good book on this, so to speak. But it is just that in a way is that men are, compared to in times past and generations past, especially compared to the 19th century, 19th century, these guys were getting in fights all the time. And they were able to brawl and stuff. And I think there was a social community standard to ensure that the brawls didn't go so far that they were, trying to kill each other or bringing weapons into the duel. There was at least social stigma around this. And generally the people you were fighting with weren't strangers. It was people within the community. And if it's somebody within the community, there's general rules that can be adhered to among these fights and grappling matches. But today, you would just be fighting with strangers and stuff and wanting to fight them and stuff. But you're seeing even more common, like violent threats among people. If you go to the airport, you'll see people getting shouting matches and almost threaten to fight each other. I was on a flight a month ago, and these two old guys were about to come to blows over, baggage. Who's putting baggage into there? And I'm like, maybe you should not get so worked up. I think people are just in general more crabby. But among general millennials, Zoomer males, yes, it's a very common thing, and I think it's driven a lot by Reddit and the popularity of nerd culture and other things, and it's leading to a general effeminacy among men, especially with I would call it NPR voice. If you ever listen to NPR and the guys come on, you're like, oh my god, this guy has to have like zero testosterone in his voice when you're speaking. And I could even hear this in other podcasts, obviously not mine, because I have a very deep high T masculine voice. But in a lot of other podcasts, you also hear that voice there. So it is a bit of a common cultural phenomenon. So now, I think that is every question. I got a ton of questions today. So if I missed your question, please email me back. I try to get a lot. We had a record for them. So I maybe didn't get to all of them. But we have one final question from New England Refugee. A New England refugee asks, you once called George Floyd the left's Horst Wessel, who Horst Wessel was a martyr for the Nazis who they made the Horst Wessel lead out of, and all that. That's for another time to talk more about it. Now it seems they've tamped down the St. Floyd worship. Is there a martyr the left can currently rally around like they did in 2020? No, I think they don't want to, because I think they don't want to remind people that Democrats are for chaos. They still have a St. Floyd worship, but it is 4 years ago. And I think Democrats want to avoid the policies they promoted after Floyd's death with defund police and being full into Black Lives Matter and all this stuff. And I think they're just trying to move away from it. I don't think they want a martyr. I think they just want to present that they've returned America to normalcy, which they did not, but they want to claim that, like, oh, compared to 2020, we now have lower crime and the economy's better and our norms are back in place. And they don't really want to have mass riots and a martyr again when it comes to the upcoming election. So yeah, they've definitely tamped down on it, and maybe that's just a change in time. But I guarantee you, when we have the 4th year anniversary of Floyd's death, there's going to be a lot of memorials and remembrances of our Saint Floyd. And he'll still go down in history as an important martyr. But I think with Democratic political priorities now, they don't want to draw much attention towards their criminal justice reform plans that they were into back in 2020, because the public overwhelmingly opposed them. And the public is, in general, hostile to all the shoplifting and looting and petty crime that's going on in cities. The problem is the people who have the power to do something about that don't want to do anything about it. So they don't want to present themselves as the party of chaos. And so I don't think they'll have a new martyr for 2020. So that is it for Highly Respected today. We had an incredible episode. We're going to have more great content later this week. So tune in for that. And I also should be, for those who like to read, I know a lot of you like to read, I Am 1776 should be publishing a dialogue I had with Lafayette Lee, Martyr Maid, and Benjamin Roberts on American Identity. I don't know which day it's going to be posted, but they said it's going to be posted this week. I think it might be posted tomorrow, but we'll see. So be on the lookout for that as well. I'll, of course, tweet that out and possibly share that on my Substack. So until next time, stay respected.